No, Rambert said bitterly. You cannot understand. You are talking a language of reason. You are thinking in abstract terms. The doctor looked up at the Republic and said that he did not know whether he was speaking the language of reason, but he was speaking the language of facts, which was not necessarily the same thing. The journalist adjusted his tie. So that means that I shall have to manage in some other way, does it? In any case, he said with a sort of defiance, I shall leave this town. The doctor said that he understood that too, but that it was none of his business. Yes, it is your business, Rambert said, flaring up suddenly. I came to see you because I was told that you had a major role in the decisions that have been taken. So I thought that in one case you might at least undo what you had helped to do. But you don't care. You have thought of no one. You didn't even consider those who were kept apart. Rio acknowledged that, in a sense, this was true. He did not want to consider such cases. Oh, I see, said Rambert. You're going to tell me about public service, but the general good consists of the happiness of each. Come now, said the doctor, who seemed to be emerging from a moment of absent-mindedness. It's that and it's other things. You should not judge. But you are wrong to feel angry. If you could just get away from this business, I should be very happy indeed. It's just that certain things in my position, it's just that there are certain things that my position forbids me to do. The other man shook his head impatiently. Yes, I was wrong to get annoyed, and I've taken up too much of your time already. Rio asked him to let him know what he was up to and not to hold it against him. There was surely some common ground where they could meet. Suddenly, Rambert seemed bewildered. I think so, he said after a pause. Yes, I think so, in spite of myself and in spite of everything that you have told me. He paused again. But I cannot approve of your attitude. He pulled down his hat over his forehead and quickly walked away. Rio saw him go into a hotel where Jean Theroux was living. After a moment, the doctor shook his head. The journalist was right to be impatient for his happiness. But was he right to accuse Rio? You are thinking in abstract terms, he had said. Was it truly an abstraction, spending his days in the hospital where the plague was working overtime, bringing the number of victims up to 500 on average per week? Yes, there was an element of abstraction and unreality in misfortune. But when abstraction starts to kill you, you have to get to work on it. And Rio knew that this was not the easiest thing to do. It was not easy, for example, to manage this auxiliary hospital, which was his responsibility. There were now 3 of them in all. He had had to convert one room, opening into the consulting room, into an admissions area. A pit dug into the floor formed a lake of disinfectant, in the midst of which was a small island of brick. The patient was transported onto the island, quickly undressed in his clothes and thrown into the water. Washed, dried, and covered in the coarse hospital gown, he was passed on to Rio, and then taken into one of the yards. They had been forced to use the courtyard of a school which now contained 500 beds in all, almost all of them occupied. After the morning admissions, which he was in charge of himself, the patients were vaccinated and the swellings lanced. Then Rio once again checked the figures before going back to his afternoon rounds. Finally, in the evening, he made his house visits and came home late at night. The previous night, when his mother had handed him a telegram from the younger Madame Rio, she had pointed out that the doctor's hands were shaking. Yes, he said, but if I persevere, I shall be less nervous. He was healthy and tough. Really, he was not yet tired, but his house visits, for example, were becoming unbearable. Diagnosing the infection meant quickly removing the patient, and here the difficulty in the abstraction began, because the family knew that they would not see the patient again until he or she were cured or was dead. Have pity, doctor, Madame Laure, the mother of the chambermaid who worked at Tarot's hotel, said Madame Laure, mother of the chambermaid who worked at Tarot's hotel. What did it mean? Of course he had pity. Where did that get anyone? He had to telephone. The siren of the ambulance sounded. In the early days, the neighbors would open up their windows and look out. Later, they hurriedly closed them. Then began struggles, tears and pleas. In short, abstraction. In these apartments, overheated by fever and anguish, scenes of madness were played out. But the sick person was taken away. Rio could go. On the first few occasions, he had merely rung for the ambulance, then sped off toward other patients without waiting for it to arrive. But then the relatives locked their doors, preferring a tete-a-tete with the plague to a separation, not knowing what that meant. Shouts, orders, the arrival of police, then later of the army, and the patient was seized by force. In the early weeks, Rio was obliged to wait until the ambulance came. After that, when every doctor was accompanied on his visits by a volunteer inspector, Rio was again able to run from one patient to the next. But at the beginning, every evening was like the one when he had come into Madame Laurette's apartment. Little apartment decorated with fans and artificial flowers, to be greeted by the mother who said with a forced smile, "I do hope it's not that fever that everyone's talking about." And he, turning back the sheet and the nightdress, stared in silence at the red patches on the belly and the thighs, and the swollen lymph nodes. The mother looked between her daughter's legs and howled, unable to control herself. Every evening mothers would shout just like that, in a distraught manner, at the sight of bellies displaying all of the signs of death. Every evening hands would grasp Rio's arms, while useless words, promises, and tears poured forth, and every evening the ambulance siren would set off scenes of distress, as pointless as any kind of pain. At the end of a long succession of such evenings, each like the next, Rio could no longer hope for anything except a continuing series of similar scenes, forever repeated. Yes, the plague, like an abstraction, was monotonous. Only one thing may have changed, and that was Rio himself. He felt that evening, beneath the monument to the Republic, aware only of hard indifference that was starting to fill him. Still looking at the hotel door where Rambert had vanished. At the end of these harrowing weeks, after these evenings when the town poured into the streets to wander around them, Rio realized that he no longer needed to protect himself against pity. When pity is useless, one grows tired of it. And the doctor found his only consolation for these exhausting days in this feeling of a heart slowly closing around itself. He knew that it would make his task easier. That is why he welcomed it. When his mother, meeting him as he came in at 2:00 in the morning, was pained by the empty look that he gave her, she was actually regretting the only comfort that Rio by then could enjoy. To struggle against abstraction, one must come to resemble it a little. But how could Rambert be persuaded of that? Abstraction for Rambert was everything that stood in the way of his happiness. In truth, Rio knew that in a certain sense, the journalist was right. But he also knew that sometimes abstraction may become stronger than happiness, and that then, and only then, should one take it into account. This is what would happen to Rambert, and the doctor would learn of it, in the details that Rambert would later come to confide in him. In this way, and at a different level, he would follow the sort of dreary struggle between the happiness of each individual and the abstractions of the plague that was to make up the life of our town for this prolonged period of time.